Turning in the direction of the thundering noise, many slaves rose their heads, only to see rocks and heavy shards of ice raining on them from above. They instantly panicked, lurching away in a cacophony of screams. Shadows happily danced on black stones as, entangled by the thick chain, those slaves fell to the ground and pulled others with them. Sonny was one of the few that remained upright, mostly because he was ready for something like this to happen. Calm and collected, he gazed at the night sky, his attribute-enhanced eyes piercing the darkness, and took one measured step back. In the next second, a piece of ice the size of a man's torso hit the ground right in front of him and exploded, showering everything around with sharp shards. Others weren't that quick. As ice and stones continued to rain, many were wounded, and a few even lost their lives. Agonizing wails filled the air.
"On your feet, fools. Get to the wall."
The veteran soldier, the one who had whipped Sonny a few hours before, was shouting angrily, trying to get the slaves to move towards the relative safety of the mountain slope. However, before anyone could heed his command, something massive came crashing down, sending a tremor through the stones beneath their feet. It fell right between the caravan and the mountain wall, plunging everything into silence for a few seconds. At first, it looked like a lump of dirty snow, roughly round in shape and as tall as a mounted horseman. However, once the creature unfurled its long limbs and rose, it towered over the stone platform like a nightmarish omen of death.
That thing must be at least 4 meters tall.
Sonny thought, a bit stunned, estimating the height. The creature had 2 stumpy legs, an emaciated, hunched torso, and disproportionately long, multi-jointed hands. 2 of them each ending with a set of horrifying bone claws, and another 2, these ones shorter, ending with almost human-like fingers. The thing that at first glance looked like dirty snow turned out to be its fur, yellowish-gray and ragged, thick enough to stop arrows and swords. On its head, 5 milky white eyes regarded the slaves with insect-like indifference. Beneath them, a terrible maw crowding with razor-sharp teeth was half open, as though in anticipation. Viscous drool was running down the creature's chin and dripping into the snow. What unnerved Sonny the most, though, were the strange shapes endlessly moving, worm-like under the creature's skin. He could see them clearly because, unfortunately, he was one of those unlucky souls closest to the monstrosity, getting a nauseating first-row view. He thought it was too much, he thought, stupefied. As soon as Sonny finished that thought, all hell broke loose. The creature moved, slashing its claws in his general direction. But Sonny was one step ahead. Without wasting a single moment, he jumped sideways, as far as the chain allowed, conveniently placing the broad-shouldered slave between himself and the monster. His quick reaction saved his life, as those sharp claws, each as long as a sword, sliced through the broad-shouldered man a fraction of a second later and sent streams of blood flying through the air. Drenched in the hot liquid, Sonny hit the ground, and his fellow slave, now simply a corpse, fell on him from above. Sonny cursed the weight. Temporarily blinded, Sonny heard a chilling howl and felt an enormous shadow passing over him. Immediately after, a deafening chorus of screams filled the night. Not paying it any attention, he tried to roll the corpse to the side, but was stopped by a forceful lurch of the chain that twisted his wrists and filled his mind with white-hot pain. Disoriented, he felt himself being dragged a few steps, but then the chain suddenly slackened, and he was able to control his hands again. He thought things could have been worse. Putting his palms against the dead man's chest, he pushed with all the strength he had. The heavy corpse stubbornly resisted all his attempts, but then finally fell sideways, setting Sonny free. However, he didn't get to celebrate this newly found freedom, as his blood suddenly turned to ice. Because at that moment, with his palms still pressed against the broad-shouldered slave's bleeding body, he clearly felt something wriggling under the dead man's skin.
You just had to think about how things could get worse, right, you idiot?
He thought, and then flinched back. Pushing the corpse with his legs, Sonny crawled as far away from it as he could, which was about 1.5 meters thanks to the ever-present chain. He quickly glanced around, noticing a mass of dancing shadows and the silhouette of the monster rampaging amidst the screaming slaves on the opposite end of the stone platform. Then, he concentrated on the dead body, which was starting to convulse with growing violence.
What are you staring at? Move away from it.
The shifty slave tried, but immediately fell down. The chain was twisted between the three of them, pinned down under by the broad-shouldered man's weight. Sonny clenched his teeth. Right under his eyes, the corpse was going through a nightmare-inducing metamorphose. Strange bone growths pierced its skin, extending like spikes. The muscles bulged and wriggled as though trying to change shape. The fingernails were turning into sharp claws, the face cracked and split. Bearing open a twisted mouth with one too many rows of bloodied needle-like fangs, Sonny thought this was not right. Sonny twitched, feeling a strong urge to empty his stomach.
Tie the chain.
The scholarly slave was just a few steps behind the shifty one, pointing at his shackles with a face as pale as a ghost. That remark was far from helpful, but given the circumstances, his shock was understandable. Being shackled was bad enough, but being shackled to such horror was truly unfair. The scholar pointed out the chain.
You too.
Sonny screamed, addressing his two fellow slaves. He called to them.
Pull on that chain as though your lives depend on it.
Because they were. The shifty slave and the scholar gaped at him and then, understanding what he was thinking, started to move. Grabbing the chain from the opposite directions, they pulled as hard as they could, tightening its grip on the monster and not letting it shake loose.
Great.
Sonny thought it was great.
The monster bulged its muscles, trying to break free. The chain creaked, caught on the bone spikes as though slowly breaking apart. Not so great.
Without wasting any more time, he threw his hands in the air and caught the creature's neck with the short, thinner chain connecting his shackles together. Then, he circled the monster with a quick step and pulled, ending up back to back with it, as far away from its maw as he could. Sonny knew that he wasn't strong enough to strangle a man with his bare hands, let alone a weird, terrifying mutant like the one trying to eat him. But now, using his own back as a lever and the weight of his whole body to pull the shackles down, he at least stood a chance. He pulled down with all his might, feeling the monster's body pressing against him, bone spikes brushing against his skin. The monster continued to struggle, clicking loudly and trying to break the chain tying him down apart. Now it was just a question of what would break first, the chain or the monster itself. He realized it was not so great.
Die, you bastard.
Sweat and blood were rolling down Sonny's face as he was pulling and pulling and pulling down with as much force as he could muster. Every second felt like an eternity. His strength and stamina, what little he had to begin with, were quickly running out. His wounded back, wrists, and muscles pierced by the bone spikes were in agony. And then, finally, Sonny felt the monster's body go limp. A moment later, a faintly familiar voice rang in the air. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard.
You have slain a dormant beast, mountain king's larva. You have slain a dormant beast, mountain king's larva.
Sonny fell to his knees, breathless. His whole body felt as though it just went through a meat grinder. Even large amounts of adrenaline could not wash away all the pain and exhaustion. And yet, he was exhilarated. The satisfaction of killing the larva was so vast that he even forgot to be disappointed about not receiving a memory, the special item tied to a dream realm inhabitant's essence, which was sometimes awarded by the spell to the triumphant awakened. A magic sword or a suit of armor would have come in handy right about now. Damn, he would even settle for a warm coat.
3 seconds, you can rest for 3 more seconds.
Sonny thought, after all, the nightmare was far from over. A few moments later, he forced himself to come back to his senses and looked around, trying to ascertain the situation. The larva was dead, which was great. However, he was still tied to it by the damn chain. The shifty slave and the scholar, both pale as death, were busy untangling it to buy the three of them at least some freedom of movement. Further away, torn bodies and pieces of flesh were lying on the ground. Many slaves were killed. A few had somehow managed to escape and were now running away. Sonny called them fools for dooming themselves. The chain, as it turns out, was at some point broken in two. That's why it suddenly slackened when Sonny was being dragged by the mass of panicking slaves. If their shackles had a less sophisticated locking mechanism, he could have tried to free himself now. However, each pair was fixed to a specific link. Without unlocking them, no one was going anywhere. The tyrant, Mountain King, presumably, was hidden from sight by the bright glow of the bonfire. However, Sunny could feel its movements due to the subtle tremors spreading through the stones, as well as the desperate screams of those slaves who were yet to perish. An angry bellow or two could also be heard, indicating that some of the soldiers were still alive, desperately trying to fight the monstrosity off. What pulled his attention the most, though, was the fact that several of the maimed bodies were starting to move. He wondered if there were more larvae. His eyes widened. One after another, 4 more corpses slowly rose to their feet. Each beast looked as disgusting as the first one had, and not a bit less deadly. The nearest was mere meters away from Sunny.
Damn it all.
He thought. He cursed it all.
I want to wake up.
As strange clicking filled the air, one of the beasts turned its head toward the 3 slaves and gnashed its fangs. Shifty fell on his ass, whispering a prayer, while Scholar just froze in place. Sunny's eyes darted to the ground, trying to find something to use as a weapon. But there was not a single thing he could use. Full of vitriol, he simply wrapped a length of chain around the knuckles and raised his fists. He wanted to wake up.
Come at me, you bastard.
The larva dashed forward with incredible speed in a flurry of claws, fangs, and terror. Sunny had less than a second to react. However, before he could do anything, a nimble figure moved past him and a sharp sword flashed in the air. The monster, beheaded with one strike, fell gracelessly onto the ground. Sunny blinked. He asked what that was. Dumbfounded, he slowly turned his head and looked to his left. Standing there with a valorous expression was the handsome young soldier who had once offered him water. He looked calm and collected, if a little grim. There was not a speck of dirt or blood on his leather armor. Sunny thought he was awesome. Sunny thought before catching himself. He called him a poser. With a short nod, the soldier moved forward to face the remaining 3 larvae. But, after taking a few steps, he suddenly turned around and gave Sunny a long look. Then, with one swift motion, the young warrior took something from his belt and threw it to Sunny, telling him to save himself. With that, he was gone to fight the monsters. Sunny reflexively caught the item and watched the soldier go. Then, he lowered his gaze and studied the thing clutched tightly in his hand. It was a short and narrow iron rod with a straight bend on its end. He realized it was a key. His heart began to beat faster. He realized it was the key to the shackles. With one last glance at the fierce battle starting between the young soldier and the larvae, Sunny dropped on one knee and began to maneuver the shackles, trying to get his hand into a suitable position to insert the key. It took him a few tries to understand how the unfamiliar lock worked, but then, finally, there was a satisfying click and he was suddenly free. The cold wind caressed his bloodied wrists. Sunny rubbed them and smiled with a dark gleam in his eyes. He told them to wait. For a moment, visions of violence and revenge filled his head.
Boyd overhears.
Shifty was waving his hands in the air, trying to get his attention. Sunny briefly considered just leaving him to die, but then decided against it. There was strength in numbers. Plus, despite Shifty's previous threats to kill him and overall unpleasantness, Sunny would have felt bad leaving a fellow slave in chains, especially since freeing him would not cost anything. He hurried over to the other 2 slaves and quickly unlocked their shackles. As soon as Shifty was free, he pushed Sunny away and did a little dance, laughing like a maniac. Shifty called to the boy.
Ah, free at last. Gods must be smiling upon us.
Scholar was more reserved. He squeezed Sunny's shoulder in gratitude and smiled weakly, casting a tense look in the direction of the ensuing fight. 2 of the 3 larvae were already dead. The third one was missing an arm but still trying to tear its opponent apart. The young soldier danced around it, moving with a graceful fluidity of a natural-born warrior. He asked what they were waiting for and told them to run. Shifty made a move to run away, but was stopped by Scholar. The Scholar started to advise.
If you say advise again, I swear to gods, I will bash your head open.
The 2 slaves looked at each other with open animosity. A moment later, Scholar lowered his eyes and sighed.
If we run away now, we will surely die.
Why is it?
The older slave simply pointed at the tall bonfire. Shifty asked why.
Without that fire, we will freeze to death before the night is over. Until the sun rises, running away is suicide.
Sonny did not say anything, knowing that Scholar was right. Actually, he realized it right after strangling the larva. No matter how terrible Mountain King was, the bonfire was still their only lifeline in this frozen hell. It was just as what the broad-shouldered slave, may he rest in peace, had said. There was no need for anyone to kill them, because the mountain itself would do it if given a chance.
So what? I prefer freezing to death than being eaten by that monster anyway, not to mention turning into one of those things.
Shifty was pretending to be brave, but there was no conviction in his voice. He glanced at the darkness surrounding the stone platform and shivered before taking a small step back. At this point, the third larva was long dead, and the young soldier was nowhere to be seen. He had probably gone to join the fight at the other side of the bonfire, leaving the three slaves alone at the mountainside part of the stone platform. Scholar cleared his throat.
Might be satiated with those it had already slain. It might be defeated or driven away by the Imperials. In any case, if we stay here, we have a chance to survive, however small. But if we run away, our doom will be certain.
So, what do we do?
Unlike Scholar, Sonny was sure that Mountain King would not be satisfied with killing just most of the slaves. Neither did he believe that a bunch of mortals would really be able to defeat it. Even if they were not normal people but awakened, a fight with a tyrant was not something one could easily survive, let alone win. But if he wanted to live, he had to get rid of that thing somehow. Shifty asked what they should do. Sonny suggested they go take a look. Shifty looked at him as though seeing a lunatic.
Are you insane? You want to get closer to that beast?
Sonny stared at him blankly, then shrugged and headed in the direction of the rampaging monster. Sonny was off to face against a nightmare creature, and not any creature at that, but one of the fifth category, a dreaded, fearsome tyrant. The odds of survival were so low that anyone would have laughed in his face if he were to ever suggest attempting to fight it, if they weren't an awakened 2 or 3 ranks above the creature, of course, which Sonny certainly wasn't. And yet, he had to deal with this Mountain King somehow to avoid an even more miserable death. The ridiculous degree to which the odds were stacked against him from the very beginning of this delayed execution had gotten old a long time ago, so he didn't have any more energy to think about it. What was there to fear, after all? He was already as good as dead. It's not like he could get any deader, so why worry? On the other side of the bonfire, things were turning from bad to worse. Most of the slaves were already dead. A few soldiers were still desperately trying to fight the monster, but it was clear that they weren't going to last long. Right in front of Sonny's eyes, the tyrant picked up a dead slave, dragging the chain up with him, and opened its terrifying maw wide. With one crushing bite, the slave's body was torn in half, leaving only bloodied stumps inside the shackles. Mountain King's 5 indifferent. Milky eyes stared into the distance as he chewed, streams of blood flowing down its chin. Seeing that the creature's upper arms were busy, one of the soldiers screamed and lunged forward, brandishing his long spear. Without turning its head, the tyrant extended one of its shorter lower arms, caught the soldier's head in an iron grip and squeezed, crushing the poor man's skull like a soap bubble. A moment later, the headless body was tossed over the cliff and disappeared into the abyss below. Shifty doubled over, puking his guts out. Then, he shakily rose to his feet and glared at Sonny. Shifty asked, "What now?" Sonny did not answer, pensively observing the tyrant with his head slightly tilted to one side. Shifty stared at him some more, then turned to Scholar.
I'm telling you, old man, the boy is sick in the head. How the hell can he be so calm?
Lower your voice, fool.
Blood drained from Shifty's face as he slapped himself, covering his mouth with both hands. Then, he cast a fearful look in the direction of the tyrant. Luckily, the abomination was too busy feasting on the slaves. lucky ones who were already dead and unlucky ones who were still alive. To pay them any attention, Shifty slowly exhaled. Sonny was preoccupied with thinking, measuring his chances of survival. The scholar hushed him.
How do I get rid of that thing?
He didn't have any special powers, nor did he have an army ready to bury the tyrant under a mountain of bodies. He didn't even have a weapon to at least scratch the damn bastard. Sonny moved his gaze and looked past the creature into the endless darkness of the moonless sky. As he was watching the night, a bright flash streaked in the air and collided with one of the tyrant's arms, bursting into a rain of sparks. The young soldier, Sonny's heroic liberator, had just tossed a burning piece of wood at the monster and was now defiantly raising his sword. Sonny wondered how to get rid of the thing.
Face me, devil. A distraction, just what I needed.
Because there was no way for Sonny to kill the Mountain King with his own 2 hands, he had decided to enlist some help. A human wouldn't be up to the task, so instead, he was planning to use a force of nature. The soldier challenged the devil. Sonny realized it was a distraction.
Since I can't do the bastard in myself, let's make gravity do it for me.
He was in the middle of thinking over the details of the plan when the young hero's foolish bravado presented an opportunity. Now everything depended on how long the pompous idiot would manage to stay alive.
Come with me,
Sonny said as he started running toward the far end of the stone platform, where the heavy wagon was perched dangerously close to the edge of the cliff. Shifty and Scholar shared a dubious look, but then followed, perhaps confusing his calmness with confidence or maybe divine inspiration. After all, it was a widely known fact that crazy people were often favored by the gods. Sonny told them to come with him.
When I tell you remove both of them, then push, understand?
What? Why?
Shifty stared at him with a dumbfounded expression on his face. Scholar just looked at the wedges and then at the tyrant. Hero, miraculously, was still alive. He was weaving between the creature's limbs, always just half a second away from being completely eviscerated. From time to time, his sword flashed in the air, but to no avail. Mountain King's fur was too thick, and his skin too tough to be harmed by mundane weapons. There was a hint of apprehension on the young warrior's face. All the other soldiers, as far as Sonny could see, were already dead. So, he really needed that one to live a little bit longer. Shifty asked what and why.
Don't die yet.
He thought he told the hero not to die yet. To Shifty, he simply said,
You'll see.
The next moment, Sonny was running again, trying to follow the chain from the brace where it was affixed to the wagon. The thing he was searching for was hard to notice due to all the bodies, blood, and viscera littering the stone platform, but for once, luck was on his side. A short amount of time later, he had found what he needed, the torn end of the chain, finding the nearest set of shackles, complete with a horribly disfigured body of a slave locked in them. Sonny plopped down on his knees and started to fumble with the key. There was a muffled scream, and with a sideways glance, he noticed Hero flying through the air, finally caught by one of the tyrant's strikes. Incredibly, the young soldier managed to land on his feet, sliding several meters across the stones. All of his limbs were still in place. There were no terrible wounds on his body either. Without skipping a bit, Hero rolled forward, picking up his sword from where it fell on the ground. And then rolled once more, this time sideways, narrowly avoiding a heavy stomp from the creature's foot. Sonny said he'd see.
Rolling, who the hell rolls around in this situation?
Without any more time to waste, Sonny finally managed to unlock the shackles, shaking the dead slave out of them. He then promptly locked them once again, this time around the chain itself, ending up with a makeshift slipknot and a loop. Now everything depended on his resolve, hand-to-eye coordination, and luck. Turning to Shifty and Scholar, who were still waiting by the wagon, he screamed, "Now!" Then, picking up a sizable length of chain, Sonny stood up and faced the tyrant. Hero spared him half a glance. His eyes lingered on the chain for a moment and then quickly followed it to the wagon. Then, without showing a hint of emotion, the young warrior doubled his efforts, drawing the creature's attention away from Sonny. Sonny thought it was a scam that the hero was smart too. clearing his head of all unnecessary thoughts. Sonny concentrated on the weight of the chain in his hands. The distance between him and the tyrant and his target, time seemed to slow down a bit. He prayed not to miss. Gathering all of his strength, Sonny spun and threw the chain in the air as though a fisherman casting his net. The loop opened as it flew, closing in on the position of the fight between Hero and the tyrant. Sonny's plan was to place the loop on the ground close enough to them that, once one of the tyrant's feet landed in the trap, he could pull on the chain and tighten it around the monster's ankle. But his plan failed spectacularly, which is to say it was literally a spectacle. In the last moment, Mountain King suddenly flinched back, and instead of falling on the ground, the chain loop landed perfectly around its neck. A second later it tightened, acting as an iron noose. Sonny froze for a moment, not believing his eyes, and then clenched his fists, holding himself back from triumphantly shaking them in the air. He screamed yes inwardly. He screamed inwardly. Moments later, the wagon would roll off the cliff, pulling the tyrant down with it. Sonny looked back to make sure, and instantly turned even paler than he usually was. Shifty and Scholar did manage to remove the wedges from under the wagon's wheels and were now desperately pushing it to the edge of the road. However, the wagon was rolling slowly, very slowly, much slower than Sonny had anticipated. He turned to the tyrant, panicking. The creature, surprised by the sudden weight pressing down on its neck, was already raising its hands to tear the chain apart. Sonny's eyes widened. In the next second, Hero crashed into one of the tyrant's legs, throwing it off balance, and buying them some time. Sonny was already running to the wagon, cursing loudly in his mind. Reaching it, he threw himself onto the damp wood alongside Shifty and Scholar, pushing with all the strength left in his rather small, but terribly beaten and enormously exhausted body. He cursed the creaky piece of shit to roll. The wagon sped up a little, but was still rather slow in reaching the cliff's edge. At the same time, the tyrant finally managed to get a hold of the chain tied around its neck, ready to free itself. Now whether they lived or not was just a question of which thing would happen first. Sonny cursed the wagon under his breath, pressing himself against it and pushing with all he had. 4 powerful oxen that used to pull it were now dead, and instead of them, 3 tired slaves were trying to do the job. Even with the slope of the road helping them, the speed of the wagon was agonizingly slow. The tyrant, in comparison, was moving much faster, pushing Hero back with a deadly swipe of his lower arms. He raised the other 2 to its neck and tried to grab the chain that was wrapped around it like a noose. However, this time Mountain King's fearsome physique turned into a disadvantage. Its long, terrifying bone claws were perfect for tearing flesh apart, but they weren't the best tool for precise manipulations. It took the tyrant some time to get a hold of the chain without slicing its own neck open. By then, the wagon was nearly at the edge of the cliff. Sonny urged them on, desperate for just a little bit more. What followed happened very quickly. The wagon's rear wheels finally slid from the road, hanging over the dark, seemingly bottomless pit beneath. The creature turned, staring expressionlessly at the 3 slaves with its 5 milky dead eyes. The wagon careened, throwing Shifty and Scholar off their feet, and then froze, balanced precariously on its middle axis. Sonny was the only one left standing. He cast a last glance at the towering monster, and then slammed his shoulder into the front of the wagon, putting all of his weight behind it. The wagon finally lost its balance and rolled over the edge, scraping its underside deafeningly against the jagged rocks. Sonny fell forward and landed on his knees, narrowly saving himself from tumbling down the cliff with it. Turning his head to the tyrant, he gave it a wicked smile. Mountain King made a move to lunge at the scrawny slave, but it was already too late. A moment later, the chain on his neck drew tight, and he was yanked back with tremendous force, flying over the edge of the cliff like a rag doll. The creature fell into the darkness silently, as though refusing to believe that it was defeated by a tiny human. Sonny thought that the bastard could go and die. Then he took one deep, ragged breath and dropped to the ground, utterly exhausted. He wondered if this was it, whether he had passed the trial. He rested on the cold stones, staring at the night sky, and waited for that faintly familiar but elusive voice to announce his victory. But instead of that, wave after wave of pain that he had earlier chosen to ignore finally started to catch up with his abused body. Sonny groaned, feeling hurt all over. The skin on his back, slashed by a slaver's whip and pierced by the bone spikes of a newborn larva especially, was in agony. He was also starting to shiver, once again consumed by the dreadful cold. He guessed not. His thoughts were slow and muddy. He wondered what else he was supposed to do. A dark figure appeared above him. It was Hero, looking calm and as handsome as ever. There were dirt and scratches on his armor, but otherwise, the young soldier appeared to be fine. He extended one arm to Sonny.
Stand up, you'll freeze to death.
Sonny sighed, accepting that his first nightmare was not over. Then he clenched his teeth and slowly rose to his feet, ignoring Hero's helping hand. Around them, there was a scene of utter carnage. Except for the 3 slaves and Hero, every member of the caravan was dead. Their bodies were littering the ground, horribly maimed or torn into pieces. Here and there, a repulsive carcass of a larva could be seen. Shadows cast by the bonfire were dancing happily across the stone platform. Seemingly unperturbed by this morbid view, Sonny was also too tired to care. Shifty and Scholar were already up, looking at Hero with weary apprehension. With or without shackles, they were still slaves, and he was still a slave driver. Noticing their tense gazes, the soldier sighed.
Come closer to the fire, all of you. We need to warm ourselves and discuss what to do next.
Without waiting for their response, Hero turned around and walked away. After hesitating for a few moments, the slaves followed. A bit of time later, the 4 of them were seated around the bonfire, soaking up pleasant heat. Shifty and Scholar were close to each other, maintaining a safe distance from Hero. Sonny sat apart from everyone, not because he had a specific reason to distrust one more than the others, but simply because he didn't like people in general. Growing up, Sonny was always a misfit. It's not that he had never tried to become close with someone, it's just that he seemed to lack the ability, like there was an invisible wall between him and other people. If he had to put it in words, Sonny would say that he was born without a small but important gear in his brain that everyone else seemed to possess. As a result, he was often baffled and stumped by human behavior, and his attempts to imitate it, however diligent, inevitably fell flat. This strangeness made others uncomfortable. In short, he was a bit different, and if there was one thing people hated, it was those different from them. Over time, Sonny simply learned to avoid getting too close to anyone and settled comfortably into his outcast role. This habit served him well, since it not only made him self-reliant, but also saved him from being stabbed in the back by shady characters on multiple occasions. That's why he was not thrilled to share the rest of this nightmare with 3 strangers. Instead of trying to start a conversation, Sonny sat quietly by himself, lost in thoughts. After a few minutes, Hero's voice finally broke the silence.
Once the sun rises, we will gather whatever food and water we can find and go back down the mountain.
Shifty gave him a defiant look.
Why should we go back to be put in chains again?
The young soldier sighed.
We can go our separate ways once we leave the mountains, but until then I'm still responsible for your lives. We can't continue up the road since the way over the mountain pass is long and arduous. Without the supplies that were stored on the wagon, your chances of making it are not high. That's why going back is our best hope.
Scholar opened his mouth, planning to say something, but then thought better of it and remained silent. Shifty cursed, seemingly convinced by Hero's rational words.
We can't go down.
All 3 of them turned to Sonny, surprised to hear his voice. Shifty barked a laugh and glanced at the soldier.
Don't listen to him, your lordship. This boy is touched by the gods. He's crazy, is what I'm trying to say.
Hero frowned, looking at the slaves.
The 2 of you are only alive thanks to this child's bravery. Aren't you ashamed to badmouth him so?
Shifty shrugged, showing that he wasn't ashamed at all. The young soldier shook his head.
I for one would like to hear his reasoning. Tell me, why can't we go down?
Sonny shifted, uncomfortable in the center of everyone's attention.
Because the monster isn't dead. Because the monster isn't dead.
These ominous words hung in the silence. 3 pairs of eyes widened, staring right at Sunny.
Why do you say that?
After thinking about it, Sunny came to the conclusion that the tyrant was indeed still alive. His reasoning was pretty straightforward. He did not hear the spell congratulating him on slaying the creature after it fell off the cliff, which meant that it was not slain. But he couldn't explain that to his companions. He pointed up.
The monster jumped from an incredible height to land on this platform, yet it wasn't harmed at all. Why would it be killed by falling off the platform?
Neither Hero nor the slaves could find a flaw in his argument. Sunny continued.
Which means that it's still alive somewhere down the mountain, so by going back, we will be delivering ourselves into its maw.
Shifty cursed loudly and crawled closer to the bonfire, staring into the darkness with terror in his eyes. Scholar rubbed his temples, mumbling.
Of course, why didn't I realize myself?
Hero was the most stoic of the 3. After thinking it over, he nodded.
Then we go up and over the mountain pass, but that's not all.
He glanced in the direction where the tyrant had fallen.
If the monster is still alive, there is a high possibility that it will return here and then pursue us, which means that time is of the essence. We will need to move as soon as the sun rises.
He gestured to the torn bodies littering the platform.
We can't allow ourselves to rest the whole night anymore. We need to gather supplies now. If there was a chance, I would have liked to give these people at least a humble burial after gathering all that we can from then, but alas, fate has decided otherwise.
Hero rose to his feet and brandished a sharp knife. Shifty tensed up and watched the blade carefully, but then relaxed, seeing that the young soldier showed no sign of aggression.
Food, water, warm clothes, firewood, that is what we need to find. Let us split up and accomplish one task each.
Then he pointed at himself with the tip of the knife.
I will carve the oxen carcasses to get us some meat.
Scholar looked around the stone platform, most of it drowning in deep shadows, and grimaced.
I'll look for firewood.
Shifty also glanced left and right, with a strange gleam in his eyes.
Then I'll go find us something warm to wear.
Sunny was the last one left. Hero gave him a long look.
Most of our water was stored on the wagon, but each of my fallen brothers was carrying a flagon. Gather as many as you can find.
Sometime later, far enough from the bonfire to be hidden in the shadows, Sunny was looking for dead soldiers with 6 flagons already weighing him down. Shivering in the cold, he finally stumbled on the last broken body clad in leather armor. The old veteran, the one who had whipped him for trying to accept Hero's flask, was badly injured and dying, but miraculously still clinging to life. Horrible wounds were covering his chest and stomach, and he was clearly in a lot of pain. His time was running out. Sunny knelt beside the dying soldier and looked him over, searching for the man's flagon. Sunny thought it was a bitter irony. The older man tried to focus his eyes on Sunny and weakly moved his hand, reaching for something. Sunny looked down and noticed a shattered sword lying on the ground not far from them. Curious, he picked it up.
Are you looking for this? Why? Are you guys like Vikings, longing to die with a weapon in your hands?
The dying soldier didn't answer, watching the young slave with some unknown, intense emotion in his eyes. Sunny sighed.
Well, it might as well do. After all, I promised to watch you die.
With that, he leaned forward and slit the old man's throat with the sharp edge of his broken blade, then threw it away. The soldier twitched, drowning in his own blood. The expression in his eyes changed. Was it gratitude or hatred? Sunny did not know. Illusion or not, it was his first time killing a human. Sunny expected to feel guilt or fear, but actually there was nothing at all. It seemed that, for better or worse, his cruel upbringing in the real world had prepared him for this moment well. He sat quietly near the old man, keeping him company on this last journey. After a while, the spell's voice came whispering into his ear.
You have slain a dormant human, name unknown.
Sonny flinched. Sonny reflected that killing people was also an achievement as far as the spell was concerned, something they didn't usually show in webtoons and dramas. He registered that fact and put it away. But, as it turned out, the spell wasn't done speaking.
You have received a memory.
Sonny froze, opening his eyes wide.
Yes, come on, give me something good.
Memories could be anything from weapons to enchanted items. One received from a dormant-rank enemy wouldn't be too powerful, but it was still a boon. Weightless and undetectable, able to be summoned from nothingness with a simple thought, a memory was incredibly useful. What's more, unlike corporeal things, he would be able to bring it back with him to the real world. The advantage of having something like that back in the outskirts was hard to overestimate.
A weapon, give me a sword.
It received a memory, silver bell.
Sonny sighed, disappointed.
Well, with my luck, what was I expecting?
Still, this thing was worth investigating. Maybe it had a powerful enchantment, like being able to send out destructive sonic waves or repelling incoming projectiles. Sonny summoned the runes and concentrated on the words silver bell. Immediately, an image of a small bell appeared in front of his eyes with a short string of text below.
Silver bell, a small memento of a long-lost home which once brought its owner comfort and joy. Its clear ringing can be heard from miles away.
Sonny thought it was a piece of crap, dejected. His first memory turned out to be pretty much useless, like everything else he possessed. He was almost starting to see a theme in how the spell was treating him. Sonny decided it didn't matter. He dismissed the runes and then got busy removing the dead man's fur cloak and warm, sturdy leather boots. As an officer, the quality of these clothes was a notch above those of the simple soldiers, after putting them on. The young slave finally felt warm for the first time since the nightmare began. Not considering the short time he had spent near the bonfire, Sonny thought it was perfect. The cloak was a bit bloodied, but then again so was Sonny. He looked around, easily piercing the veil of darkness with his tenebrous eyes. Hero and Scholar were still in the middle of their tasks. Shifty was supposed to be looking for winter clothes, but was greedily pulling rings off the dead men's fingers instead. Unseen to them, Sonny hesitated, considering if he had really thought things through well. His companions were unreliable. The future was too uncertain. Even the requirements of passing the nightmare remained a mystery. Any decision he could make would have been a gamble at best. Still, he had to make some if he wanted to survive. Not wasting any more time thinking, Sonny picked up the flagons and sighed. They spent the rest of the night seating with their backs against the bonfire, staring fearfully into the night. Despite the exhaustion, no one could sleep. The possibility of the tyrant coming back to finish the 4 survivors off was too frightening. Only Hero seemed to be fine, calmly sharpening his sword in the bright light of the dancing flames. The sound of the whetstone scraping against the blade was somehow comforting. At the break of dawn, when the sun had lazily begun to warm up the air, they loaded themselves with all the supplies they'd managed to gather and set out into the cold. Sonny looked back, taking in the sight of the stone platform for the last time. He had managed to get past the place where the slave caravan was supposed to perish. What was going to happen next? No one could tell.